Good afternoon and welcome to the Department of State in Washington, D.C. Today we have successfully relaunched direct negotiations among the United States, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority in pursuit of a final agreement, a final settlement, and a just peace, two states living side by side. George Mitchell will give a statement and answer a few of your questions, but we still have meetings going on with the parties, and he'll have to return upstairs rather rapidly to rejoin the negotiations. But here's Senator Mitchell.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The parties have just concluded the first round of trilateral talks. The meeting lasted about an hour and a half. It began with a plenary session involving the full U.S., Israeli, and Palestinian delegations on the 8th floor of the State Department, and then broke to a smaller meeting in the Secretary of State's personal office involving Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Abbas, Secretary Clinton, and myself. Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas then went into a separate meeting for a direct discussion. That meeting is still going on right now. In the trilateral meeting, there was a long and productive discussion on a range of issues. President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed their intent to approach these negotiations in good faith and with a seriousness of purpose. They also agreed that for these negotiations to succeed, they must be kept private and treated with the utmost sensitivity. So what I and they are able to disclose to you today and in the future will be limited. But I will now describe some of the key items that were addressed in the trilateral meeting. Both Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas condemned all forms of violence that target innocent civilians and pledged to work together to maintain security. They reiterated their common goal of two states for two peoples and to a solution to the conflict that resolves all issues, ends all claims, and establishes a viable state of Palestine alongside a secure state of Israel. President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed that these negotiations can be completed within 1 year and that the aim of the negotiations is to resolve all core issues. The parties agreed that a logical next step would be to begin working on achieving a framework agreement for permanent status. The purpose of a framework agreement will be to establish the fundamental compromises necessary to enable them to flesh out and complete a comprehensive treaty that will end the conflict and establish a lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The parties agreed that in their actions and statements, they will work to create an atmosphere of trust that will be conducive to reaching a final agreement. They agreed to meet again on September 14 and 15 in the region and roughly 2 weeks thereafter, every 2 weeks thereafter. Of course, continued interactions at other levels between the parties and also yet others involving the United States will take place between those meetings. In fact, a preparatory trilateral meeting to plan for that second meeting in the region has already begun in another location in this building and will continue here and in the region between now and September 14th as is necessary. As both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have said, the United States pledges its full support to the parties in these talks. We will be an active and sustained partner throughout. We will put our full weight behind these negotiations and will stand by the parties as they make the difficult decisions necessary to secure a better future for their citizens. As we saw this week, there are those who will use violence to try to derail these talks. There are going to be difficult days and many obstacles along the way. We recognize that this is not an easy task. But as the President told the leaders, we expect to continue until our job is complete and successful. And with that, I'll be pleased to take some of your questions.
Senator, I'm Jeff Asher with CCTV News out of Asia. I would like to know, what was their personal relationship? At times when you saw them next to each other, it seemed like they were kind of distant. Did they seem to interact? Did they seem to develop any kind of bond or relationship together?
The relationship was cordial. As you know, these men have known each other for a long time. This is not the first meeting between them. They're not in any way strangers, politically or personally. And I felt that it was a very constructive and positive mood, both in terms of their personal interaction and in terms of the nature of the discussion that occurred.
Thank you. Nadia Bilbisi with NBC Television. Senator, President Obama yesterday talked about some progress when asked, and I appreciate the fact that you don't want to divulge too many details, but today Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about the Jewishness of the state, which is considered a non-starter issue for the Palestinian. Just generally, do you think that these issues can you bridge the gap, considering there is obviously so many difficulties, but since the launch in the negotiation today, do you think this could be an issue that could be an explosive for the whole issue, for the peace process?
First, I believe very strongly, deeply and personally, that this conflict can be resolved and that these negotiations can produce a final agreement that enables the establishment of a Palestinian state and peace and security for both peoples. Secondly, it is, of course, self-evident that the reason for a negotiation is that there are differences. The differences are many, they are deep, they are serious, and it will take serious, good faith negotiations, sincerity on both sides, a willingness to make difficult concessions on both sides if that agreement is to be reached. But I don't think that any human problem can be solved if one begins by reviewing the problems as insurmountable, as suggesting that the mountains are too high and the rivers are too wide, so let's not undertake the journey. There has to be a sincerity and a seriousness of purpose combined with a realistic appraisal and understanding of the difficulties, but a determination to overcome them. I believe that exists. I believe these two leaders, President Abbas and Prime Minister Netanyahu, are committed to doing what it takes to achieve the right result.
Hello, Senator Mitchell. Major Garrett, Fox News. You remember well from your life on Capitol Hill the phrase, whenever a tough negotiation was going on, nothing is agreed to until everything is agreed to. Will that be the operative approach, you believe, for this process? And as a result, will you be reluctant to talk about anything that's agreed upon until everything is agreed upon? That's one process question. The second one is, you discussed the framework. Is the deadline for the framework 1 year, or is the framework something we're likely to see much earlier and the 1 year still governs the entire solution to all remaining issues?
In terms of process, that and other questions will be resolved by the parties. You cannot separate process from substance in these discussions. There is an interaction that affects both, and we've made it clear that these issues are to be determined by the parties. We have had extensive discussions with them on that and many other issues, and those will continue. Our goal is to resolve all of the core issues within 1 year. And the parties themselves have suggested and agreed that the logical way to proceed to tackle them is to try to reach a framework agreement first. And as I said, and I think this ought to be made clear because there has been a good bit of misunderstanding or not a full meeting of minds publicly regarding a framework agreement. A framework agreement is not an interim agreement. It's more detailed than a declaration of principles, but is less than a full-fledged treaty. Its purpose is to establish the fundamental compromises necessary to enable the parties to then flesh out and complete a comprehensive agreement that will end the conflict and establish a lasting peace.
Thank you. Charlie Wolfson with CBS News. You mentioned that a number of issues were talked about today, but can you mention specifically that settlements was among them? And do you plan to be in the region for the talks that will take place on the 14th and 15th and at the table as well? Though you said the U.S. would be a part of the talks, take an active role, do you plan to be there for those talks? And can you tell us where they're going to be?
As I said at the outset, what I will be able to disclose to you and what the parties will disclose will be limited. And so you've given me the first opportunity to invoke that principle with respect to the first part of your question, for which I thank you. Secondly, both Secretary Clinton and I will be at the meeting in the region on September 14th and 15th. And one of the subjects now being discussed in the trilateral preparatory meeting that's ongoing in another room in this building, to which I must go in a few moments, is that subject. So a determination has not yet been made. That will be made, I believe, obviously in the near future and well in advance of the meeting.
Garrett? And then we'll go there and then come back.
Garrett Radia with ABC News. I would like to take another crack at it after Charlie. I understand and appreciate that you can't get into specifics about what was talked today, but I'm curious whether you could speak about the scope of today's talks, whether they did involve any substantive discussions on any of the core issues, or whether this was strictly to lay out the plan for the coming year. Thanks.
As I mentioned in my response to Major's questions, I don't think one can neatly characterize process and substance as though they're two separate things in these matters. They do interact and relate. You can't discuss a process issue in any meaningful way without some relations to the substance that's being discussed. And so, as I appreciate you said you're taking another crack at Charlie's question, and that gives me the chance to say for the second time that I'm not going to be able to get into the substance. But yes, there were discussions that touched on substance, although I don't want to suggest to you that the meeting was such that there was a detailed and extended discussion or debate on a specific substantive issue.
We'll come over here and we'll wrap up.
Ron Campius from JTA. It appears from this morning that obviously there weren't any substantive concessions. There have been rhetorical concessions. President Abbas talked about security, which is something that Netanyahu's wanted him to talk about. And Netanyahu yesterday at the dinner talked about recognizing a Palestinian claim that there